Over 10 days in the autumn of 2008, in 4 separate auction rooms in southern Africa, buyers from China and Japan bought 102 tons of elephant ivory. It was entirely legal. It was approved by the international body that regulates the wildlife trade, supervised by its officials, and the $15.5 million it raised went back to the 4 selling countries for conservation. The argument for it was simple, and on paper, sound. Ivory had been banned for 19 years, and the poaching had never stopped, so put a large legal supply into the market, satisfy the demand, drop the price, and take the profit out of killing elephants. 3 years later, elephant poaching was at the worst level ever recorded. Somewhere over 100,000 elephants were killed in 3 years. And 18 years on, I have to tell you that we still cannot say whether those two facts are connected. I'm Arthur Beckett. I am standing in a government strongroom in southern Africa, in a windowless concrete room, stacked floor to ceiling with tusks. Tens of thousands of them, tagged, numbered, and worth either $600 million or almost nothing, depending on who you ask. This is the most uncomfortable film I have made, because I am going to spend most of it explaining why I do not know the answer. To understand why anybody thought selling ivory was a conservation measure, you have to go back to what the 1980s actually looked like. The commonly quoted figures are that Africa held about 1.3 million elephants in 1979 and about 600,000 10 years later. I want to flag straight away that neither of those is a census. Nobody counted a continent. They are reconstructions, and the modeled range for the earlier one runs from 1.1 to 1.8 million. What is not in doubt is the direction and the rough scale. The population approximately halved in a decade. Something like 800 to 1,000 tons of raw ivory was leaving Africa every year, the great majority of it illegally. Around 75,000 elephants a year. And the price went vertical. Ivory ran at about $3 a pound in 1975 and $125 a pound by 1987, a 40-fold rise in 12 years. But the number that actually tells you what was happening is a much quieter one, and it is the one I would put on the screen if I could only have a single statistic. In the 1970s, it took 54 dead elephants to produce 1 ton of ivory. By the late 1980s, it took 113. The tusks were getting smaller because the animals carrying big tusks were already gone. The hunters had moved on to younger animals, and then to females, and then to whatever was left. That single ratio, doubling in 15 years, is a population being eaten from the top down. On the 18th of July 1989, in Nairobi National Park, the president of Kenya set fire to 12 tons of confiscated ivory, around 2,000 tusks, worth about $3 million. It was the idea of Richard Leakey, then running the Kenyan Wildlife Service, and it is worth knowing that it happened 3 months before the vote. It was designed to influence. It was not a celebration. It was lobbying, on fire, in front of the world's cameras. It worked. On the 17th of October 1989, at a meeting in Lausanne, the parties to the Wildlife Trade Convention voted 76 to 11 to move the African elephant to the strictest level of protection. The international commercial ivory trade became illegal on the 18th of January 1990. And I have to give you the other side properly, because this film does not work if I do not. 5 southern African countries voted against it: South Africa, Zimbabwe, Botswana, Namibia, and Eswatini. Their argument was not that they wanted to sell ivory to poachers, it was that their elephant populations were stable or growing, that they held large stockpiles of ivory accumulated legally from animals that had died naturally or been culled by their own management programs, and that the revenue from selling it funded the rangers, the fences, and the parks that were keeping those elephants alive. They were being asked to burn an asset to solve somebody else's crisis. I have met the people who make that argument. They are not villains, and it is not a stupid position. And here is the flaw, sitting underneath all of it, on both sides. Nobody knew. Nobody knew. Nobody knows now whether putting a legal supply into a market for a wildlife product suppresses the illegal trade or feeds it. There are 2 respectable economic arguments, and they point in opposite directions. Legal supply might undercut the poachers and crash their margin, or it might launder illegal stock, signal that ivory is an acceptable thing to own again, and grow the market it was meant to satisfy. Both are plausible. Both have been argued by serious people for 40 years. So in 1999, and again in 2008, we did the only thing that could settle it. We ran the experiment on a live population across a continent with no control group. The first sale was small and deliberately experimental. In 1999, and again in 2008, we did the only thing that could settle it. We ran the experiment on a live population, across a continent, with no control group. The first sale was small and deliberately experimental. In 1999, Botswana, Namibia and Zimbabwe sold 49.5 tons of stockpiled ivory to Japanese dealers for about $5 million, roughly $100 a kilo. The second was the real one. It was approved in June 2007 at a meeting in The Hague, and the approval came bundled with a promise: a 9-year moratorium on any further ivory sales proposals. That was the deal. One more sale, and then nobody asks again for nearly a decade. The auctions ran over 10 days the following autumn. Namibia on the 28th of October, 7,226 kilos. Botswana on the 31st, 43,153 kilos, the largest lot. Zimbabwe on the 1st of November, 3,700. South Africa on the 6th, 47,356. 102 tons, give or take. $15.4 million, an average of somewhere around $152 a kilo, and about 60% of it went to China. I should say that the figure you will most often see quoted for this sale is 108 tons. That was the volume approved and offered. About 102 actually sold. Some of it did not find a buyer. Then came the years that everybody agrees about. Poaching climbed, and it kept climbing, and it peaked in 2011. Work published in 2014 estimated that more than 100,000 elephants were killed in the 3 years from 2010 to 2012, around 8% of the entire continental population in the single year 2011. The Great Elephant Census, which actually flew the surveys rather than modeling them, counted 352,000 savanna elephants across 18 countries and found the population had fallen 30%, 144,000 animals, between 2007 and 2014. So, a legal sale in 2008 and the worst poaching on record by 2011. Now I have to be extremely careful, because this is the point where almost every documentary about ivory stops thinking. In 2016, 2 American economists published an analysis arguing that the announcement of the 2008 sale corresponded with an abrupt 66% increase in illegal elephant killing across 2 continents and a 71% increase in ivory smuggling out of Africa. That figure, 66%, is now everywhere. It is in newspaper articles, in campaign material, in other documentaries. It is treated as the settled finding that legalization backfired. Here is what I think you should know about it. It has never been peer-reviewed. It was released as a working paper in June 2016, revised in 2019, and 10 years later it is still a working paper. There is no journal version. Nobody has published a replication either supporting or refuting it in a peer-reviewed venue. And the scientific body that owns the underlying data rejected it, in writing, in front of the convention. The technical advisory group that designed the elephant poaching monitoring system submitted a formal statement to the 2016 Conference of Parties saying the paper was, and I am quoting, fundamentally flawed, both in logic and methodology, and should not be used to inform elephant policy. The statisticians who built the monitoring framework published their own critique. The model treats a proportion as though it were an unbounded quantity. It ignores the 2008 global financial crisis happening at exactly the same moment, and it never tests whether a smooth curve fits the data as well as a sudden break. The economists answered, and their answer is not nothing. They reran the analysis using the advisory group's own recommended method, and got essentially the same result, a coefficient of 0.128 against their original 0.129. And they pointed out that no comparable jump appears in Chinese gold or jewelry sales in the same period. So where does that leave us? The peer-reviewed literature that does exist does not support the clean story. A study in 2019 looking at poaching across the continent found it tracked local poverty, national corruption, and the global ivory price, and did not identify the 2008 sale as a discrete cause at all. Another paper the same year put the inflection point in the ivory price at 2007, a year before the sale. The honest position, which almost nobody will say out loud, is this: the sale and the surge are correlated. The causal claim rests on a single unreviewed paper that the relevant scientific body has formally repudiated and that nobody has replicated in either direction in a decade. It is not established. It is also not refuted. We do not know, and I want to sit in that for a moment, because it is the whole point of this film. We made a decision that affected a species across an entire continent. We made it in order to find something out, and then we built no way of finding it out. There is one more fact here, and it is the one that damages everybody's story equally. Between 1989 and 2014, that is, across the entire period of the international ban, the global price of ivory rose by about 1,000%, tenfold. Under prohibition, whatever the ban did, it did not make ivory less valuable. So what actually turned it around? Because something did. On the 30th of December 2016, China announced it would close its domestic ivory market. It was phased through 2017, 34 carving factories and 143 retail outlets shut by the end of March, and the trade became fully illegal on the 1st of January 2018. China was the destination for most of the world's ivory. Closing that market is the single largest thing anybody has done about this since 1989. And here is the detail I find most interesting, because it says something about how markets in contraband actually work. The price collapsed before the ban took effect. Raw ivory wholesale in China ran at about $2,100 a kilo in early 2014. By late 2015, it was $1,100. By February 2017, 10 months before the market legally closed, it was $730, a 65% collapse driven by the announcement rather than the enforcement. The traders read the signal and got out ahead of it. Consumer surveys tell a similar story. The share of Chinese consumers reporting buying ivory in the previous 12 months fell from 31% in 2017 to 12% in 2020. Although, and I will not leave this out, it ticked back up to 15% in 2021, and the proportion describing themselves as committed buyers actually grew. The poaching numbers followed. The Continental Indicator peaked in 2011 and has fallen since. The estimated annual poaching mortality rate at monitored sites dropped from about 10.5% in 2011 to under 4% by 2017, and levels have been broadly stable from 2020 to 2024. That is a real, measurable, hard-won improvement, and the people who did it deserve to hear it said plainly. If this is the kind of story you want more of, subscribe. I only make these when the record actually supports them. 4 things sit alongside this story, and each one changes how you read it. In Gorongosa National Park in Mozambique, a long civil war funded partly by Ivory took the elephant population from about 2,500 in 1972 to 242 by the year 2000. Before the war, about 18.5% of the females in that population were born without tusks. Among the females who survived it, that figure was 51%. In the first generation born afterwards, a third. A study published in 2021 worked out the survival advantage. A tuskless female was about 5 times more likely to get through than a tusked one. The probability of that shift happening by chance is roughly 1 in 1,000 million. And there is a strange second finding. Tuskless mothers produce about 2/3 daughters. That is exactly what you would expect if the gene that removes the tusks sits on the X chromosome and kills male calves before they are born. So every tuskless female is, in effect, carrying a mutation that halves her sons. We shot the tusks out of a population in 28 years, and the ledger for it is being paid by male calves who never get born. I have to add the honest part. The male lethality is inferred, not demonstrated. It comes from the fact that nobody has ever recorded a tuskless male at Gorongosa, and absence of evidence is not the same thing as proof. The causal mutation has not been identified, and the appealing coda you will hear, that tuskless elephants suffer for it at the feeding grounds, has not been published. There is one small study showing they use their trunks slightly differently. That is all there is so far. The vicuña is a small wild camel of the high Andes with the finest wool of any animal on Earth. By the 1960s, there were fewer than about 10,000 left, shot for their fleece. They were given the strictest protection in 1975. And then, unusually, certain populations were moved back down to a level that permits regulated trade. Peru and Chile in 1987, more of Peru in 94, Argentina and Bolivia in 97, on the condition that the wool came from live animals. What the communities revived to do that was a pre-Inca ceremony called the chaku, in which hundreds of people form a human chain across the high plateau, drive the vicuñas into a corral, shear them, and let them go. Peru's national census, published in June this year, counted 364,000 vicuñas. From under 10,000 to over 360,000, by giving people a legal reason to want them alive. That is the strongest argument the sustainable use side of this debate has, and it deserves to be stated at full strength. Now the other half, which is almost never stated at all. The population recovered. The people did not. Published work found that Andean producers receive under 5% of the final value. A scarf retailing at nearly $2,000 contains about $95 of raw fiber. In one of the flagship communities, revenue fell roughly 80% between 2012 and 2022. Residents work the roundup unpaid as community service, and a Peruvian government study found that 80% of them said they had not benefited. The price the communities are paid for the fiber has fallen by more than a third in a decade. So the vicuña is a genuine conservation success and a genuine development failure at the same time, and the two get bundled together every time somebody uses it as an argument. Southern African governments are sitting on something in the order of 500 tons of ivory. Zimbabwe alone holds around 130 tons and has publicly valued it at $600 million and more recently 700. At the prices ivory actually fetches, that stock is worth somewhere between $9 and $50 million, depending on which market you imagine selling into. The government valuation implies a price roughly double the illicit market's all-time peak. And there is no buyer. In December last year, Namibia asked the convention for a fourth one-off sale of its 46 tons. It was rejected by secret ballot, 22 votes in favor and 82 against. South Africa declined to even submit a proposal, its minister saying the conditions were not favorable. So the strongroom stays shut, costing about $500,000 a year to guard, holding an asset that is simultaneously priceless and unsellable. And you can see standing in here exactly why the argument will not die. Japan still has a legal domestic ivory market. It is now the only major one left. As of late 2024, there were 5,700 registered traders operating almost 9,000 facilities, and the country holds around 175 tons of registered whole tusks. The number I would watch is a different one. The stock of registered cut ivory, pieces, not whole tusks, went up by about 10 tons in 2 years. That is not a market winding down. At the convention meeting in December last year, 4 African elephant range states asked for a formal invitation to Japan to close it. Japan opposed. The invitation was not adopted. Here is what I take from all of it. We had a genuine, serious, unresolved question. Does a legal supply feed a black market or starve it? We just a good question. It has consequences. And in 1999, and again in 2008, we ran the only experiment that could answer it. We just never kept a control. And there is only one Africa. So we now have the worst of both outcomes. We have the cost of the experiment, however much of that 100,000 dead elephants belongs to it, which may be all of it or none of it, and we do not have the answer, because we ran it on a continent in the middle of a financial crisis, a corruption crisis, and a demand boom, with 4 separate things changing at once and nothing held still. The tenfold rise in the ivory price under a total prohibition, and the 65% collapse in that price on the mere announcement of a market closure, are both real. And any theory you have needs to survive both of them. Mine barely does. What I am fairly confident about is narrower and duller than the argument. Elephants stopped being killed at scale when the largest buyer stopped buying, not when the sellers were banned, and not when the stockpiles were sold. The demand side moved the needle. Everything else moved the price, and what I am certain about is the strong room. There are tens of thousands of tusks in this building, every one of them an animal, and the argument about what to do with them has now been running for longer than most of those elephants were alive. Standing in here, my mind keeps going out to the country beyond the fence, to the open grassland these animals shape, where a single elephant pushing over a single tree decides what grows there for the next 50 years, and where the argument is no longer about ivory at all, but about whether there is any room left for an animal that rearranges the landscape. That is a different journey. For now, thank you for standing in the strong room with me. If you want to keep following journeys where the price of a thing hides the cost of a world, subscribe to the channel.